In 2017, Air Berlin carried 30 million passengers a year. It was Germany's second largest airline. 18 months later, it was gone. Not restructured, not rescued, absorbed. The same year, Monarch collapsed in Britain. Alitalia entered its final spiral and Virgin America was erased into Alaska's brand. 3 airline groups now control almost every flight that matters. Not on paper. On paper, there are 50 brands, but through mergers, joint ventures, and equity stakes, 3 blocks have locked up the sky. Imagine if the M1, the Autobahn, and the US Interstate were controlled by 3 firms whose shareholders matter more than their passengers. That is effectively what's happened in our sky. We aren't just watching consolidation, we're watching the closure of Western airspace. The open skies era is over, and the era of the cartel has begun. Flights don't vanish by accident. Whole airlines don't just fail because they struggled. These disappearances follow a pattern the big groups have quietly perfected. And once that pattern took hold, the middle of the market never stood a chance. The part nobody notices is what these airlines were originally built to do, because that is where the real shift began, and it changes how you see everything that comes next. A middle carrier was the airline that filled the space between the ultra-cheap operators and the global giants. The link that kept smaller cities attached to the wider economy and stopped the big groups from drawing the map entirely on their own terms. They didn't just serve regions, they stopped the giants from turning passengers into a captive market. Most were created in the early jet age with governments watching over them. They weren't built to squeeze every seat, they were built to keep countries connected and to keep prices within reach for ordinary travelers. Bergen to London and back in a day was normal because someone had designed an airline to make it normal. Remove that layer and the giants faced no pressure to behave, on fares or on service. And once that pressure faded, the carriers did too. Then the whole system tilted. In the US, it happened at speed. Around 2000, 8 major carriers shared the domestic market. After 9/11, the industry didn't hesitate. It used the crisis to redraw the board whilst regulators looked the other way. Delta took Northwest, United folded Continental into itself, American pulled US Airways inside, and Southwest brought AirTran under its wing without much ceremony at all. By the mid-2010s, 8 competitors had become 4 groups controlling almost everything. Routes that didn't serve their model simply slipped out of the timetable. I've watched airports go from busy to barren in less than a decade. Europe shifted the same direction, just later. Once the EU loosened the rules, 3 groups moved fastest. Lufthansa Group, IAG and Air France-KLM. They bought into rivals, took over flag carriers and built portfolios of airlines that kept their old names but not their independence. Real control moved upstairs. By the mid-2010s, most full-service airlines in Europe answered to one of these 3 owners. Since 2015, more than 20 independent carriers across Europe and the US have vanished outright. No restructuring and no second life. Let's look at the airlines that people actually cared about. Virgin America arrived in 2007 with clear purpose and more personality than the incumbents liked. Passengers noticed. That alone was enough to make it inconvenient. Alaska bought it and the brand disappeared almost immediately. Air Berlin had been Germany's second largest airline. It served cities the flag carrier didn't prioritize and carried millions each year. When it failed, nobody kept it whole. The strongest pieces went straight to Lufthansa. Malev was Hungary's national airline for over 60 years. It connected Budapest to the continent and kept the country visible in European aviation. Then, in 2012, it collapsed with no rescue. The airline disappeared and no one replaced it. None of these airlines vanished because flyers abandoned them. They vanished because the rules now reward size above everything else. Popularity and history mean nothing when the structure is set up for giants. And the choice you think you have is thinner than it looks. In Europe, 3 groups control more than 50 brand names. Lufthansa Group covers Swiss, Austrian, Brussels Airlines, Eurowings and others, while IAG holds British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus and Vueling. Air France-KLM runs its own cluster. They look like separate carriers, but many of those brands function as different fronts for the same owners. In the US, 4 carriers dominate domestic seats, but 3 of them, American, Delta and United, aren't just American airlines. They're the anchors of the same 3 global blocks that control Europe. America runs Oneworld with BA and Iberia, Delta runs SkyTeam with Air France-KLM, and United runs Star Alliance with Lufthansa. Southwest is the only major carrier outside the system. Booking sites tried to maintain the illusion. Pages of logos, endless options. Strip that back and you find the same three blocks deciding prices, routes, and whether your city stays connected. So if your airport feels smaller or your direct flight has disappeared, it isn't the weather or demand. It's the disappearance of the layer that once protected you. The blocks write the rules now. The real question is how they secured that position and who held the door open for them. So if these mid-size airlines were so important, why did none survive? Luck wasn't the issue, the structure was. The market didn't evolve away from them, it was rebuilt so the middle couldn't function. By the early 2000s, scale stopped just being an advantage, it became the weapon. The mega carriers didn't just outfly their rivals, they outfinanced them. They used their sheer bulk to negotiate fuel and maintenance deals that smaller players couldn't get near. When Air Berlin needed to renew its engine maintenance contracts, Lufthansa's bulk purchasing power meant the same service cost Air Berlin significantly more per flight hour. This wasn't just down to skill, it was down to finances. When oil prices spiked in 2008, the giants hedged and absorbed the shock. The mid-tier simply couldn't. They ran out of cash, and once that started, there was no recovery. Capital followed the same logic. Investors and lessors looked at the consolidation underway and decided the blocks were the only safe bets. Money flowed upwards, and the challengers were left without backing and slowly squeezed out. Alitalia flew Italy's flag for 74 years, but decades of debt and political interference left it unsustainable. After multiple bailouts, it was finally shut down in 2021. The government created ITA Airways to take its place. Smaller, leaner, and easier to sell. And in 2023, Lufthansa agreed to buy a controlling stake. A G7 nation preparing to hand its national airline to a foreign group because the market leaves no other option. But the significant barrier was physical. The most valuable asset in aviation isn't just a jet, it's the right to land it. The legacy giants already controlled the prime slots at the major hubs and held them tightly. If a mid-sized carrier wanted to launch a new route from a key airport, there was no viable entry point. The slots were already spoken for. Imagine trying to open a shop when your competitor owns the access road. That is how the slot system works. Regulators didn't push back. In 2013, the US Department of Justice approved the American-US Airways merger, despite internal warnings about market concentration. In Europe, Brussels waved through consolidation after consolidation. They let the structure settle exactly as the giants preferred. Look at London Heathrow. British Airways didn't secure its position by competing its way to the top. It absorbed BMI and took its slot portfolio in one move. Between BA and its partners, they now control most of the airport. Regulators didn't defend competition, they defended the incumbents and let them expand. Where consolidation couldn't buy full control, coordination has taken its place. Airlines built alliances and joint ventures that let them coordinate schedules and pricing legally. High-value corporate travelers were kept inside these systems through loyalty schemes designed to minimize defection. If you chase status, you stay inside the walls. In this industry, loyalty isn't really a reward. It's a method of keeping you where they want you. For the middle tier, this created a downward spiral. Without prime slots, they were pushed to awkward timings at remote gates. Without business travelers, the routes didn't generate enough revenue to survive. Since 2005, over 300 city pairs across Europe have lost their year-round service. And let's be real, a network without flow isn't a network. And none of this was unavoidable. In Asia and the Middle East, mid-size airlines still operate because their markets followed different policies. The collapse of Western middle tier was a choice. We built a system where the middle had no path to survive, which is why my quick trip to Stavanger now includes 3 hours in Paris with a glass of warm lounge wine. And that tells you everything. Since 2019, almost 400 regional air routes have disappeared across Europe. One by one, the unprofitable hops between smaller cities were cut. In Scandinavia, remote communities lost their last air links, leaving them with hour-long drives or ferries. The same pattern is playing out from France to Germany. Secondary routes removed as the giants retrench around their hubs. Now, the airlines will tell you this was inevitable. They'll point to the pandemic. And I won't pretend COVID wasn't a major factor, but here's the truth of it. COVID provided the perfect alibi. The fact that none of these routes have returned, and that nearly half a dozen independent airlines have been folded into the big group since, suggests these cuts served the business model better than the passengers ever did. And if this logic can wipe out a region's air links, it can do the same to entire countries. It doesn't take long for the bill to arrive. With competition gone, fares on the remaining flights didn't just rise, they spiked. In Germany, when Air Berlin went under, Lufthansa suddenly had the monopoly. Overnight, ticket prices on those uncontested routes leapt by 25 to 30%. No planes got fancier, no service improved. They charged a monopoly premium for the privilege of having no other choice. Back when airlines had to compete, the system had slack. If one carrier stumbled, another stepped in. Now, that slack has been asset stripped. In a system this tightly wound, one glitch can knock out an entire region. Consider what that means at the macro scale. In the United States, the dominant carriers now control roughly 80% of all domestic seats. In Europe, the top three groups command nearly 60% of capacity. They've learned not to ruin a good thing by sparking a price war. Competition isn't disciplining them anymore. Public outrage is. The only reason your ticket isn't more expensive is because they don't want the bad press of gouging you too hard, too fast. So if you need to fly, you'll pay what they ask. So here we are. Three blocks rule the sky. They've slashed routes, squeezed staffing, and carved up the map. And for everyone outside those empires, travelers, workers, and entire cities, it's a precarious new reality. Our connectivity, our jobs, our holidays, and our business trips all hinge on decisions made by a few groups with absolutely no reason to put our interests first. One more crisis and the cost becomes undeniable. At 93 of the 100 largest airports in the United States, one or two airlines now control the vast majority of seats. I experienced this firsthand. I fly out of Knoxville, which once had its own hometown carrier, Tennessee Airways. Today the choice is so thin that I fly when the algorithm allows, not when it suits me. Most journeys begin with a slog through a packed, crumbling hub like Charlotte just to reach anywhere useful. That is the reality of the regional market. We endure the hubs because you have no other path to the world. Across the industry, the few remaining independents are being pulled into the gravity of the giants. TAP is lined up for sale, Lufthansa is absorbing ITA, SAS has surrendered its independence to Air France-KLM, and Alaska has taken Hawaii. Even JetBlue's dependence on the legacy system makes a future takeover plausible. These are the final steps in closing the net. The result is an hourglass industry. At the top, a few global empires control the network, and at the bottom, ultra-low-cost carriers chase thin margins. But in the middle's a dead zone. Once the hourglass narrows, it does not widen again. Imagine you're launching an airline in 2025. You've got the planes, the routes, the ambition. Here's what kills you. The first wall is money. In the 1990s, you could start an airline with a business plan alone. Today, that door is welded shut. Investors know the odds. You can't IPO, you can't scale. Your only success is to be bought by the very group you are trying to compete with. You're not building a challenger, you're grooming yourself for acquisition. The second wall is regulation. Look at JSX. They found a legal side road, operating under charter rules that let them hire and train pilots much more quickly. And it worked, so the majors didn't compete. They lobbied to shut it down. American and Southwest demanded that JSX be forced under the same 1,500-hour rule, a regulation requiring co-pilots to log 1,500 flight hours before joining a mainline carrier. That applies to their own crews. They claimed it was about safety. Well, it wasn't. It was about closing the door on a new competitor. And even if you find a crack in the pavement, you're still on borrowed time. Breeze and Avelo aren't competing with the giants, they're avoiding them. The system no longer allows the formation of a new JetBlue. It's unfortunate, but the middle isn't regenerating. There's a flicker of resistance. Regulators are finally realizing that the open skies are closed. The US blocked the Spirit merger. Brussels has forced slot sell-offs. Some governments are even using minimum service rules to ensure entire regions aren't completely abandoned. These are small wins, but they prove the direction isn't fixed. It can be redirected if there is the will to fight. So if this continues, flying will become a fully controlled environment. Routes will vanish the moment they miss a quarterly target. Innovation will stall because the giants choose predictability over risk. Disruption will spread further each time a dominant carrier stumbles. It only feels abstract until your city loses its last direct flight. And control is no longer a byproduct of consolidation, it is the goal. And the fight for the sky is far from settled. Airline executives promised that consolidation would make flying better, and they sold us on stability, cleaner fleets, and the strength to compete globally. It sounds plausible until you step onto the plane. Walk into any long-haul cabin today and try to spot the difference. It feels like the entire industry ordered its future from the same IKEA catalogue. I used to fly different airlines because they felt different. They had quirks, a sense of place, and a specific philosophy, and that is disappearing. Innovation has become just a paint job. Competition has become the upholstery. You aren't choosing an airline anymore. You're choosing which version of the same spreadsheet irritates you least. And this sameness isn't accidental. It's exactly what happens when the largest airlines hide inside metal-neutral joint ventures. These arrangements allow rivals to behave just as one carrier, sharing revenue, coordinating schedules, and setting fares together. Metal-neutral means they don't care whose aircraft you sit on because the money goes into the same pot. The alliances which developed into these joint ventures were sold as a way to help passengers connect. They ended up protecting the incumbents from ever having to compete. In this market, you aren't choosing between airlines, you're choosing between 3 blocks wearing 50 different uniforms. This is the end state. The hourglass has set, and the middle isn't coming back. Lufthansa Group and its star partners dominate Central Europe and Italy. Air France-KLM and SkyTeam hold the Nordic world and Benelux. IAG controls Britain, Spain, and Ireland, linked closely to American Airlines through the One World Pact. And in the US, the same 3 blocks have divided international flying between them. Southwest remains outside, but only because it never left the US. Across the Atlantic, it is even more concentrated. 3 joint ventures control about 80% of the seats between Europe and North America. On most routes, you aren't comparing airlines, you're choosing which member of the same team gets your money. The cost of this isn't loud, it creeps in, and a direct flight disappears, a fare jumps, a cabin becomes generic, and you fly at the times the blocks allow, through the hubs they prefer, on the seats that match their template. You pay more, you get less, and somehow the fault is always yours for expecting choice. This was never about stabilizing the sky. It was about securing the market for themselves. They didn't save the industry, they captured it. For the Sky Digest, I'm Jan. And no matter who buys Tap Portugal next, you will not catch me dead transiting in Lisbon. Some connections just aren't worth the punishment. Cheers.